Today, we are going to talk about what happens during a longer fast, and in particular, a 5-day fast. So we're going to kind of go through what happens in your body as far as energy goes, as far as energy needs go, because that is the main thing that is changing from hour to hour, right? Like our bodies need energy to survive. We would die without it. I mean, that is very obvious, but where our energy is coming from, how we're utilizing it, all of that is changing from moment to moment. So let's go through this. And this podcast episode is not going to be for everybody. Not everybody is looking to do a long fast or even maybe a 24-hour fast, but I do want to walk you through the logistics of it and why I even promote this and what it is, what these longer fasts, who these longer fasts are more appropriate for, because they're not appropriate for everybody at every time in the stage of their life. So we'll talk about all of that, but let's talk about what happens in those first 12 hours or so. So what's funny I don't know if funny is the right word. What's interesting to think about is that a lot of people aren't even fasting for 12 hours on most days, right? They're eating right until the time they go to bed, maybe up until 8 or 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, have a snack right before they go to bed, getting up at 6 or 7 in the morning. And they've only been without food for 8 or 9 hours in a lot of cases. And this is true for many, many children as well. So even just thinking about not fasting for a minimum of 12 hours most days is a reality for a lot of people. So let's start with those first 12 hours. And honestly, I know I'm a promoter of intermittent fasting and longer fasts as a therapy. But there are so many that aren't even hitting this 12-hour mark. And in my opinion, I believe everybody should be fasting for a minimum of 12 hours every single day. We should not be in a feast mode and feasting and eating longer than we're fasting. That's just not how human bodies are designed. That's why we've gotten in such a huge predicament and our metabolic health is such a disaster. I mean, if people would even just get that 12 hours, I like to call that gut rest, because really you should be, and this is of course while you're sleeping for the most part. So most of those hours are sleeping, but that should be the bare minimum for you to at least stay where you are metabolically and not advance to worse metabolic health. You're probably not going to reverse any disease processes with just fasting 12 hours most days, but you can at least maintain your metabolic health with that level. So what happens in the first 12 hours is honestly not that much, which is why I believe this should be the bare minimum for everybody, children included. Not so much like toddlers. They do need to eat a little bit more often, but children, there's no reason for them to be eating more hours out of the day than they're fasting, including their sleep, of course. And if they're eating well-rounded, high nutrition, foods that are giving them the nourishment that they need, we should have to be eating more often than that. So what's happening in the first 12 hours? Glycogen is starting to be utilized, right? So glycogen is the storage form of carbohydrates. So we've finished utilizing that food that we've eaten, and now our body is turning more to glycogen for fuel. So this is highly variable from person to person, depending on their sex. Males can store more glycogen than women, and it's highly variable depending on your diet and how often you're eating. If you're eating a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of grains, a lot of sugar, your glycogen stores are going to be more full and maxed out than somebody who is not eating a lot of carbohydrates, and maybe they're following a higher protein, higher fat, maybe even a ketogenic diet or a low carb diet. they're not going to be maxing out their glycogen stores every day. And so that person is going to run through that stored fuel, the stored glucose, much more quickly than somebody who's eating all the time and eating excessive carbohydrates, lots of sugar, lots of ultra processed food. So not a lot is happening in the first 12 hours. Glycogen stores are starting to be utilized, and blood sugar might be starting to come down, which for a lot of people, that is a positive thing, right? We want those blood sugars to start to decline. Sometimes when people have a lot of blood sugar issues or they're very insulin resistant, in the overnight hours and the early morning hours, their blood sugar might actually start to rise a little bit, even though they haven't eaten. This is called the dawn phenomenon. I've done lots of podcasts on this. We've talked about this a lot in podcasts, but when you have very severe insulin resistant or have dysregulated blood sugars, that dawn phenomenon can pop those morning blood sugars up, and sometimes they can stay elevated until you eat and release insulin. This isn't, I don't want to say this is normal, but it is common in people with type 2 diabetes, prediabetes, fatty liver, even PCOS, when your blood sugar is dysregulated. And this can correct itself over time, but that can be common that you see higher blood sugars bump up because of the dawn phenomenon, where your body is releasing counter-regulatory hormones such as cortisol, human growth hormone, and that's going to bump up those morning blood sugars a little bit. So ketones are starting to rise after 12 hours also. Not much. Like it's like I said, you're starting to run through those glycogen stores. So then your body's like, "Oh, like I need an alternative fuel here. I'm getting low on glucose. I don't have a lot more stored. So now I need to find an alternative fuel, which is ketones." So this is normal. Everybody, like you would not live very long, or you'd have to like get up and eat during the night if this process didn't occur. So it's normal for ketones to start rising. This is not ketoacidosis. Some people are like, "Oh, my ketones are starting to rise. That's not a good thing." Ketoacidosis basically is a problem for type 1 diabetics because they're not releasing insulin on their own. But for the vast majority of us, rising ketones is a good thing. This means that we are more metabolically flexible. We can use our glucose, but then when our glucose starts to decline, we can then switch over to our other fueling system in the form of ketones. So this is good. So again, the changes are basically in energy, right? It's like all the processes going on in our body are not that much different at this stage of the game, 12 hours in. We're just starting to fuel differently. We're starting to get through the glycogen and the glucose and starting to tap into ketones. And again, this is highly dependent on how much you've eaten, how often you're eating, when the last meal that you had, how much carbohydrate you're taking in, how much fat you're taking in. All of those are variables. We need to remember too that no matter where our energy is coming from, whether it's from carbohydrate and glucose, whether it's coming from protein, which can be converted to glucose, or whether it's coming from fatty acids, from fats, or ketone bodies that are byproducts of fat metabolism, everything is converted to ATP, which is where we get our energy from. And I could go through the numbers, how much ATP we are utilizing in a second. It's staggering. It's like trillions of ATP for all of our cells. It's just a crazy number, but we won't get it far into that today. But just know that all of the energy that you are utilizing as a human needs to be converted to ATP in order for us to survive. And if we didn't have this, we would not survive more than basically a few seconds. So we need oxygen for this process, and the cycle just continues. So let's talk about what happens as we progress through a fasted state. We start to become what's called in a low energy state. Not that our energy levels are starting to go down, especially if we're metabolically flexible. Like we might feel great as we continue to fast. A lot of us do who are metabolically flexible, and we start to convert to metabolism more and more and rely more and more on ketone bodies. We feel great, but our body is in a state of low energy because we don't have fuel coming in. We're not eating anymore. And so a substrate called AMP kinase, is starting to increase at this stage of the game around that 18-hour mark, 12 to 18-hour mark, again, depending on what you ate, how much storage you have, where it's starting to recognize that it needs to find more energy, right? The energy is not coming in. We're not eating. We're in a fasted state. So now we need to start looking for alternative fuels. And what happens is we start to upregulate fat metabolism because we go through that carbohydrate stores. It's a finite amount of glucose, a finite amount of glycogen, and then the body starts to upregulate fat metabolism. So that is happening around that 18-hour mark where more fat burning is starting to occur. The glycogen stores are starting to become very minimal, especially if you're low carb or ketogenic, and now we're tapped into fat burning. We're starting to make more ketones. And a lot of people argue about fasting and intermittent fasting and how it's bad for the hormones, how it's bad for women, how it's bad for this or that. But inflammation is decreasing at this stage around that 18-hour mark. Inflammation is decreasing. Human growth hormone is increasing to protect your muscle mass. BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, that is starting to increase. That makes you feel mentally sharp. Brain synapses are starting to fire and become more. We'll just say neurogenesis is coming, or is starting to become more apparent, and brain connections and synapses are just starting to fire and be created. So these are all great things, right? Like this is a lower inflammatory state once those ketones start to rise. So another thing to think about, this is the beginnings of autophagy. And I've done entire podcasts on the process of autophagy as well. But autophagy, remember, is like a dimmer switch. It's not like it's on or off. It's not like, oh, I'm in autophagy, I'm out of autophagy. It's the intensity revs up the longer you're in a fasted state. So autophagy is really starting to become more pronounced at around that 18-hour mark. The beginnings of autophagy are happening. And another thing to keep in mind is that exercise, I've talked about this before as well, exercise really just accelerates all of these processes that are happening, accelerates autophagy, because I've talked about exercise and fasting being the primary ways to get into autophagy and really get into deeper levels of autophagy. But the beginnings of autophagy are happening, and exercise accelerates all of this. Now, when you're in a deeper fasted state or a longer fasted state, chances are you may not want to do really intense exercise, but walking, lower intensity exercise can really help to even accelerate. And some people even do strength training during longer fasts because the human growth hormone has accelerated so much. That exercise can be really helpful in a fasted state. And some people do claim they have their best strength training sessions when they're fasted. I know I always do strength training in a fasted state. I've only done about 16 hours of fasting by the time I do my strength training, but I prefer to be in a fasted state. I don't prefer to have a lot of food in my stomach when I'm exercising. So that works for me. So you start to think about, we've been told breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And I'm not saying that you can't ever eat breakfast or that it's bad to have breakfast. And really, anytime we break our fast is breakfast. But a lot of people are, coming out of sleep and eating pretty quickly after they've gotten up in the morning, and they're eating high sugar, high carb foods. And we're just going to take ourselves right out of any sort of autophagy process that we're starting. Our blood sugars are already bumped up a little bit from that morning dawn phenomenon. And then we're sticking all the sugar in our bodies that we don't need, from muffins and pancakes and juice and fruit and yogurt and oatmeal and toast and bread. And even though, these can be worked in small amounts here and there, for the most part, like, we just don't need all that carbohydrate in the morning. But this is the start of all those processes. And then once we get to the 24-hour mark, that's where autophagy is really starting to rev up. And the meaning of the word autophagy is self-eating. Okay. So our body's basically looking for energy sources in the form of fat. And so as ketones rise, some of these processes are triggered. But autophagy means self-eating, that clean out mechanism. So it's going to look for old cells and debris and proteins, proteins that aren't folded correctly, that are, that shouldn't be there. Your body's going to start eating that and getting rid of that and using that for fuel. So that's pretty awesome. So it starts to decide, like, what cells, what proteins, what should I keep? What's really precious here? Let's look at the amino acid pool. Let's look at, what's available in the body. And it really starts to just scour the body. It's not having to digest food, which is really beautiful. It can focus on just cleaning out all the garbage. So autophagy is revving up. There's more recycling going on in the body. Human growth hormone continues to increase. That brain-derived neurotropic factor, that's going up. AMPK is going up. mTOR is going up. And so is another substrate called NAD. So the body is so intelligent. We cannot we can't disregard that. Your body is so smart. It's not going to, like, break down its own heart tissue or break down brain tissue or kidney tissue for energy when it has stored body fat. Like, it's just so amazing. So it's extremely intelligent, and 24-hour mark is where insulin is really low as well. So again, there's a lot of talk and debate about intermittent fasting and fasting protocols. And, you really just need to realize what your goal is when you're setting up a fasting protocol, your macronutrients. Like, what is your goal? What are you trying to achieve? If it's reversing insulin resistance and chronic disease, insulin is really low at 24 hours, and ketones are starting to climb, and all of these great things. So again, going back to exercise, like, exercise will intensify autophagy, but a lot of the same processes, a lot of these substrates that are increasing, hormones that are increasing, also increase with exercise. So fasting and exercise do a lot of the same things for the body, which is super interesting to think about. So when you are exercising, your AMPK decreases, your mTOR decreases, insulin decreases, and fat burning increases, just like what happens with, when the fasting is going on. So again, we need to think about, what we're trying to achieve with a fast, and everybody's different. A lot of times people like to ask me, what's your fasting protocol? When do you fast? When do you eat? What do you eat in your meals? I am not trying to lose weight. Far from it. It would be unhealthy for me to lose weight at this point, because I'm at a very healthy weight and a very healthy body composition. If anything, I would want to put on a little bit of muscle mass at this point in my life, but I'm not looking to lose weight. I'm insulin sensitive. I've reversed my insulin resistance. And so for me, we want to think about eating and, being in, like, a fasted state and a feasted state. For me, it doesn't make sense for me to be in a fasted state as often as I was when I was reversing insulin resistance. And so if you have a lot of extra fat that you're trying to burn off, or you have a metabolic disease of some sort, it makes sense for you to be in a fast state more than you're in a feasted state. So you have to have a balance. And so a lot of times, people who are struggling with type 2 diabetes or fatty liver or any other metabolic disease, high blood pressure, lipid issues, high triglycerides, over the course of their lifetime, they've been in a feasted state a lot more than they've been in a fasted state. Whether or not it's healthy foods or whole grains or what have you. And that's what happened with me. It's not like I was eating all this junk, but I was eating from the time I woke up in the morning. And sometimes until the time I went to bed, I was, snacking throughout the day. It was healthy food, but I really wore out my insulin sensitivity because I was raising my insulin all the time. And so we really need to think about the frequency of food when, deep and the fasting, depending on our goals and where we're at right now. So insulin resistance develops when we are putting out too much insulin day after day after day, year after year, decade after decade in a lot of cases. So again, a lot of times it's not so much about the quality of food. I mean, it definitely can, but it's more about the frequency of eating, and more fasted hours are necessary than feasting hours when you're trying to restore the insulin sensitivity and, go back to being insulin sensitive and reversing your metabolic disease. Then we need to be more hours of fasting, and talk about, and think about implementing some of these longer fasts. And a lot of times people, kind of correlate intermittent fasting or longer fasts with eating disorders. And that always bothers me. I've always been very clear about, if you have an active eating disorder, intermittent fasting and fasting protocols are not for you. Like you need to get therapy and professional help for that. But I would argue that having to eat 5 or 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, however many times you're eating throughout the day, that is more disordered eating than being able to only eat a couple of times a day and have healthy blood sugars throughout the day, eat a meal that is nourishing, high in protein, high in fat, lower in carb, that is satiating you for 5 to 6 hours, and you're not thinking about food. Who wants to be thinking about food all the time when you're a sugar burner and you're having to eat every couple of hours and, burn off burn through glucose, and your body cannot transition to fat burning? To me, mentally, that's more disordered than somebody who only has to eat once, twice, maybe 3 times at most during the course of the day. So you need to think about, with fasting protocols, the need to correct metabolic problems, right? That is what I teach. And so if anybody gets in my face about, people, fasting is just caloric restriction or intermittent fasting is disordered eating. And unfortunately, sometimes people turn to it initially because of that, but it corrects metabolic disease, and it's the most potent strategy to do so because it brings insulin so low, and that restores your insulin sensitivity, which eventually will put these awful metabolic diseases into remission. And they can stay in remission forever as long as you follow the guidelines of a low insulin lifestyle. But once we get to about 48 hours in, so these are 2-day fasts. And for me, again, I'm not trying to reverse metabolic disease. I only do a 48-hour fast or more, maybe once a year, twice a year at most. Like I'm just not in that stage anymore. But for people who are very insulin resistant, are on insulin, have severe fatty liver, these fasts are very therapeutic and are what are really going to turn their metabolic issues around. So at 48 hours, human growth hormone has increased by 500%, which is amazing. That's an amazing thing for your body to do in a fasted state, because that human growth hormone is preserving your lean tissue. It's saying, hey, body, we don't have fuel coming in. We're raising human growth hormone so that we don't break down muscle and protein and things that we really need in the body. It forces your body to look for fat instead and preserve lean tissue. That BDNF is going up even more. That, brain derived neurotrophic factor, the autophagy is revving up. The ketones are revving up because we're using fat now. Your body says, no carbs, no glycogen, I need fuel, and it will start fueling on ketones and fatty acids instead. Another thing I think I mentioned already is ketones are used for fuel, but they're also used as signaling molecules. So when ketones really start to increase, this signals a lot of these other processes to happen, because the body's like, whoa, well, ketones are really high. I must not have any glucose coming in. And so a lot of these other processes are triggered. Another thing that happens is ghrelin increases, and this is kind of the opposite hormone of insulin. So when insulin's really high, ghrelin's low. When ghrelin's high, insulin is low. Ghrelin is basically our hunger hormone that says, hey, I'm hungry. I need some food. And ghrelin's one of those things that goes away after 15, 20 minutes. It's not going to keep saying, Shanna, you need to eat right now. It kind of is like a little annoying knock on the door. You ignore it, it will go away. And it might go away for a few hours. It might go away for several hours, kind of depending on how deep into your fast you are. It might even go away for a couple days if you're in a longer fast, but it's temporary. So that's important to remember about ghrelin. That hormone is temporary, where ketones are just gonna stay high because now there's no fuel coming in and they're breaking down stored fat. You're breaking down stored fat and having fatty acids instead. Another thing around that 48-hour mark, there's a lot of brain repair going on. There's longevity increases happening. There's increases in wound healing, because you take that digestion process away. That's very energy demanding and very taxing on the body. I mean, obviously we need to eat, but if you take that away for a finite period of time, your body can do all of these amazing things. So cardiovascular health is improving also, because your insulin is low, your insulin sensitivity is being restored. The glucose isn't high circulating around in the bloodstream, and excessive glucose can clog things up too. Insulin's low, inflammation is coming down, and markers of metabolic syndrome are coming down after just 48 hours. So it's really, really amazing. And again, I don't promote long fasts all the time for any of my clients. It's not like you want to do these continuously, 48 hours, eat a meal, 48 hours. Like I do, when I'm working with students who are very insulin resistant, we look at their lifestyle, we look at their goals, and we set up a pattern that's going to work for them. But 48 hours, 72 hours, it's not something you need to do if you're at a healthy weight and you've reversed your disease process and all your metabolic markers are good. But for the vast majority of American adults, that's not the case. And so at the 72-hour mark, now we're at 3 days into a water fast only. We're in even deeper autophagy, more cleanups happening. We're getting rid of more waste, misfolded proteins. So those are basically kind of precursors to cancer a lot of times, where, protein is folded in a very intricate way, those amino acids, and it doesn't always happen perfectly. So some of those proteins are misfolded and those get cleaned out. The body says, oh, these aren't good. These aren't perfect. We're going to clean them up and eat them. We're going to use this as energy. Stem cell regeneration and rejuvenation starts to increase at 72 hours. And so this helps with white blood cells. It helps our white blood cells to become more efficient, our immune system to become more efficient. And another thing that this is very protective against is chemotherapy and our immune system, to offset if you happen to be going through chemotherapy. My regular listeners know that my mom is battling stage 4 cancer right now and going through chemotherapy. And, I explain this whole process to her before she started her chemo treatments, and she did it for the first one. But after that, she got very ill, and just the protocols, it just wasn't in her mind. And her oncologist told her that she shouldn't fast and that fasting isn't going to be helpful. And it's just very sad to me. It's like oncologists should know about fasting and what happens at certain marks in the body at certain hours, and not shy. I mean, instead, they give their cancer patients a bag of Ensure full of sugar and seed oils and all kinds of chemicals, and send them on their merry way and say, drink this while you're going through chemo, rather than fast, let your immune system be bumped up, let your ketones protect you. I mean, it's unbelievable. But just know, like that, like I do have fasting protocols available that down regulate the cells for a certain amount of time prior to chemo. You get your chemo, you keep them down regulated. It's a total of 72 hours. And then that chemo can be very, very better utilized and targeted to the cancer cells rather than killing healthy cells. And so that happens around that 72-hour mark. And that's why, the cancer protocols that are established, the fasting and the ketogenic diet, that's why they kind of target that 72-hour mark. And so if we happen to get all the way to a 5-day fast, not much new is happening in terms of like this hormone is increasing, or, this substrate is really increasing, this decreases. It's just the degree of all of these things just increases and intensifies. So it's more intense autophagy, more intense, insulin sensitivity being established again, because now insulin levels have been very low for many, many hours. Fat burning continues, right? So if your goal is to reverse obesity and to reverse a fatty liver, the fat's stored. If you have fatty liver, there's just way too much fat around the organs in your liver. Your body's going to be eating that, right? That's what's happening during your long fast. Your body's eating, it's stored energy, it's eating away, old cells and getting rid of them. It's eating things that shouldn't be there. It's not going to be breaking down your organs. It's not doing that. It's too smart for that. It's breaking down things in that process of autophagy that aren't supposed to be there. So the degree of all the markers is increasing, and it's just allowing for more time for fat burning, more time for low insulin, and just really turning things around in the body. Another thing that tends to happen around that 5-day mark, and for students that work with me, and there aren't many who do these longer fasts, but 5 days is kind of where I say, okay, let's do a 5-day, maybe every couple months, but that's it. Like, there's not a whole lot that happen, that's going to be super helpful for you after the 5 days. You're going to continue with eating fat for fuel, all of that, but 5 days is around the time where your body just kind of forgets old set points. Like, I've talked about the set point theory of weight, where you just seem to feel like you're stuck at 150 pounds, or you're stuck at 180 pounds. Maybe you started at 225 pounds and you lose down to 180, and you're just like, I am just stuck. Or you're down to 150 and you're doing all the things, but your body just seems to be stuck there. So at the 5-day marks of fasting, and that's a long fast for a lot of people. And a lot of times people can't even fathom this, but that's where your body tends to forget those set points. So a 5-day fast can be really awesome for really stubborn cases of chronic disease. And so a lot of times people ask me, or they want a chart, like, well, how many hours does this happen? Or how many hours does this happen? You're like, when is my insulin really low? Or when does autophagy start? I can give you, I kind of talked you through the averages, but it's really dependent. It's very, very a personal thing. So I can't say like autophagy at 18 hours and 20 minutes, like it's really roughing up, because there's a lot of variables. It depends on what you ate. It depends on how many carbohydrates you're taking in. It depends on your insulin sensitivity, the health of your body, whether or not you have metabolic disease. All of these things play a role. There's a lot of variables. And But we do, after a certain amount of time, tend to keep a certain baseline of processes. So, after a couple of days, you're going to have like a baseline glucose amount, a baseline insulin amount. Your body is really increases that human growth hormone after 2 or 3 days of fasting. But then after that, it just kind of stays the same to preserve that lean tissue. Ketones, kind of stay the same after a certain amount. And so it's really, really very personal. But again, we have to look at like, why are we doing these long fasts? What's the purpose of them? What am I trying to accomplish? If you're trying to accomplish disease reversal, these longer fasts can be game changing. There's plenty of people who will tell you otherwise. There are plenty of people who will say, if you're a woman, don't fast. If you have hypothyroid, don't fast. If you have, cortisol issues, don't fast. And I agree with some of these things to a certain point. Women should only be doing longer fasts at certain times in their cycle if they're cycling. If you have very severe thyroid issues, you should get your thyroid optimized prior to doing longer fasts. If you have cortisol issues, maybe you ease into the longer fast, or you fast more in the evenings than in the mornings. But again, they're very anti-inflammatory and they correct a lot of metabolic disease processes. So wrapping up, again, after that 12 hours of fasting, ketones and autophagy is barely existent. So if you're somebody, or, we know plenty of these people who have basically never skipped a meal in their entire life, like they're eating 12 hours or more every single day. They're really not ever letting their body get into autophagy unless they're like super exercising, maybe a little bit, but that autophagy process isn't really setting in until, after the 12-hour mark for sure. Ketones aren't really high unless you're doing a really high fat diet with super low on carbs. But even at that stage, if you're eating all the time and you're eating fat every day, you're burning the fat that you're eating from your meals, right? You're not eating your stored body fat. So if your goal is stored body fat, that's different. Like being in ketosis doesn't necessarily mean you're eating fat stores. It just means you're burning fat as fuel. So I hope that makes sense. That 24 to 48 hour mark is where, you really see dramatic increases in all of the hormones that I talked about. 72-hour fasts, that's really where disease reversal can be really starting to set in. And so when people work with me and they have severe insulin resistance, we work up to like the therapeutic amount, which is 24 to 72 hours. It's generally what I'm teaching people, somewhere in there, because that's really where magic is happening. But again, for somebody like me who I should not be losing weight, at this point, my insulin sensitivity is good. When I do longer fasts, it's more for longevity and autophagy purposes. So I usually only do a long fast like once a year around Easter time. At this point, it's more for religious purposes, but I love the autophagy. I love the longevity part of it. And then, maybe one other time during the year, but those aren't my goals anymore because of where I'm at. But for somebody who's really, really ill, has a lot of weight to lose, has a lot of extra body fat stored, is very insulin resistant, goals are very different. And these longer fasts can be very therapeutic and help to, reset you metabolically and restore that metabolic sensitivity. So I know that long fasts, those can be scary to think about. And you do need to nourish yourself correctly after you come out of a long fast. There's lots of podcasts on that as well. But I would encourage you to, if this is newer information and you're just like, gosh, I don't even know where to start. This is overwhelming. How do I break my fast? What nutrition do I use? I would highly encourage you to think about enrolling in Low Insulin Academy, which is my high-level program course that opens again January 2nd. The live version opens again with group coaching. It's 6 modules. The live coaching program lasts for 8 weeks. You can do the course on demand as well. All of the lessons are the same in all of the modules, but I do open it up for live group coaching with me, and I lead you through the course a couple of times a year. So if that's something that sounds like you want to do it, you have insulin resistance or you have any of the diseases we talked about today, get yourself signed up. You can get on the wait list and save 10% 20% at enrollment if you go to fasttoheal.info/waitlist. That'll get you a discount code mailed to you when our class opens, our enrollment opens on January 2nd. Also, one last plug that I forgot to talk about at the beginning of the episode is that my 12 Days of Christmas starts Friday. So December 1st, that's going to be super fun. If you think you want to enroll in Low Insulin Academy, there might be a day in that 12 days where you're going to be really happy. So watch for that. December 1st through December 12th, I'm going to be putting out one offer every day. It will only be good for that day. So I highly encourage you to bookmark my special page my web page for it, because then you won't miss anything and you can just go to the page every single day rather than having to, wait for the email and click on the offer. It's fasttoheal.info/gifts. So it's in the show notes. Make sure to bookmark that. So every day you can check what my deal is for the day. Only be good for that day. And then it's going to close. And then the next offer is going to pop up. So it's going to be super fun. I'm really excited for it. So watch for that, bookmark the page, and I will see you back next week for another episode.